Here is a green ink by Ancient Charm on the love of Lotus.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I like green inks, and this one is an interesting tone that just has no specific appeal to me. Though there is nothing wrong with it, just doesn't feel right. It's generally consistent in tone and shading, making this a boring and predictable ink. Let's remember that for me, boring is a good thing because it is so predictable. You know exactly what you're getting all the time. And this ink isn't finicky about what pen or paper it's on, which is another point in its favor, yet still feels wrong for me. It shades well, but nowhere as much as many other greens that I've tried in the past. I will say that at the end of this video, on the yellow Rhodia, it looks at its very best.
The pen for today is a Mnemosyne Fission. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the lightest. It's really, all the other tones are going to be the same. The soft fine is always going to be much lighter. I really use it because it's such a dry pen, and combined with this, it exposes the lightest tone that an ink can give, which we get here. I find it a bit too light to think of a whole page pleasantly written with this. Now, it does not feather. It does not spread. It shades perfectly well, and especially when it shades, it's easier to read. So I just find the tone too light for a whole page of writing. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade fairly well through most of the writing. We get some areas without some shading, like on the second line you'll see so on and then it starts shading back up again with further. So it shades well. I wish it gave some of the much darker shading that we see on the very first word of there, though. It doesn't seem to ever get that dark, except for if the pen's sat for a little bit. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It shades just as well as the soft fine. It's there. It's not bad at all. It's not doing... I just feel disappointed looking at it as what I was expecting from it when I did the swatch. I really was expecting a lot more shade. Maybe some of the disappointment is my own fault. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade. It shades fairly well. In every single word, you get some lighter and darker letters. It does give a little bit of personality to some of the writing, though, again, it feels off. I wish I could nail down, and hopefully by the end of this recording, I get it nailed down to be able to say. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairefontaine, though flatter, as we'll really be coming to expect with this paper. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. Technically, there's tiny bits of shades, but it's barely noticeable. You have to go looking for it. So I'm going to say that it's not really shading on this ink or on this paper. An unfortunate thing with this ink, but it just doesn't seem to be coming across there. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is the same tone that we got on the Clairefontaine. It's got one spot of feathering. That is the first word on the top line. Recommendation. At the EC, I see tiny bits of feathering, but that's the only bit of it. No spread. It is shading just about as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. Maybe a little less frequently, but still shading about as well. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, same tone as on Clairefontaine. It is not feathering. It is not spreading. I'm going to take back the feather because I just saw one spot. On the third line, he has some feathering in it. But that's it. It seems like it just wants to feather in one little spot. I'm not going to count it against it. I'm going to call it a paper issue. Perhaps little oils from my hand. It does shade. It shades about as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, which is a real high point for this ink on non-fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as on Clairefontaine. It does feather again in a couple spots, but a couple more spots on the T of get, the letter I on the word I on the second line. We see little bits of feathering. And on the third line, at the end of alive and the question mark quotes, we see little bits of feathering. Now, it's also got a little bit of spread occurring, which I don't know that I've seen much of with this paper. Generally, the performance is fairly nice. Looking at the back of the page, you see that you probably could not use the back of where the medium was. You might not want to use the broad or, well, you could use the soft fine and the wet fine. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, though.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a slightly darker tone than we had on the Clairefontaine, just slightly. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. I think it's shading just as much as on the Clairefontaine, but it looks a little bit more noticeable. The yellow tone of the paper, or the yellowish tone of the paper, I think is really helping it come through. I think it looks better on the toned papers than it does on white paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. The same tone as the Clairefontaine. Just more frequently has the darker tone than the Clairefontaine, but the same tones. Not feathering. I do see a tiny bit of spread happening. We do still see the same shading going on as on the Clairefontaine, but more of the darker tones than the Clairefontaine had. But we're seeing both of the mid and darker tones and just as frequently back and forth. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as Clairefontaine. I was really expecting a bit more change here than I got. Only really saw it with the soft fine. I'm rather surprised. No feathering, no spreading. Even though the wet fine spread, that's probably because it was a wet pen, but this is a medium flow pen, so no spreading at all. Shading is much less than we had on the Clairfontaine. There is little bits of shading that are there, but much less noticeable. It's really a straightforward green here. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little lighter than it was with the medium, just a bit lighter, and it's lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, we do get tiny bits of feathering that are occurring. I mean, you see it in the L of feel, and on the third line, you see it on apprentices. You see it on take in the second line. There's a couple spots. There's a tiny bit of spread that's going on. Neither the feathering or the spread seem like they would be a problem to me. It's not really shading at all. It is just this lighter tone the whole way through, so we lost it here. Looking at the back of the page, very minor ghosting. Even though in some spots it appears to be getting a little deeper into the page, nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. Though it's shading a little less than it did on the Clairfontaine. I think the slight off-white of the paper is what's having that happen. But it's shading very well in how it does it, considering how we've seen this ink shade. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is the same tone as on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade, though the shading is a little less noticeable than on the Clairfontaine because we get more of the darker tones and less of the lighter tones. You can see where it's shading well when you look at the word mountain or on, even the word it in the third line. It is shading well. We just have more frequent dark and less of the light. It's like it's reversed here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as on Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Still having some of that, it's missing something. I'm waiting to really get it nailed down. It's missing something, and I can't, but something's off. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It shades about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but for some reason isn't standing out as much. It's very weird to describe. You know, I think what it is the blue they used that showed in the chromatography. I think if that blue was a little bit darker of a blue, it would have really helped this ink have some punch. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Emerald. Here is KWZ Green Gold number 2. Here is Monteverde Yosemite Green. Here is Private Reserve Foam Green. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as Clairfontaine, just a little bit flatter of a tone. Not that it had to flatten out very much, but it's the same in darkness and everything, just slightly less of itself. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. It's shading, I think, a little more noticeably than it did on the Clairfontaine, though less frequently when it does it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading going on fairly consistently, doing, I think, a pretty good job considering this paper. I would say this green is a good ink with the wet fine here. I like this darker that I'm getting on this paper. This is fairly nice. It's one of my favorites in how this ink looks through all of the writing samples. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, a tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is not shading, it is just a lighter tone. And the difference between this and the wet fine, I would not use this for this paper if I'm really wanting to be able to look back on it and like what I'm seeing, just not caring for it here. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, which is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. Technically, there's a few spots I can find that are a bit darker, giving it some shading. Like on the third line, the starts lighter and gets darker. Broad starts as a mid-tone, gets light, goes to mid and dark at the T. It shows it can do it, but it's not going to do it a ton, and it's not going to be a standout feature on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, there's no problem with ghosting, and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Graf von Faber-Castell, Burnt Orange. Here is a purple ink by KWZ Iron Gall Violet number 3. Here is a black ink by Pelican Onyx. Here is a red ink by Colorverse Redshift. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, especially in any of the darker areas. It does spread a little bit, especially in any of the darker areas, which means, yes, it does shade some, but if it does it, it brings some feathering and some spread with it. All of that aside, I don't think what we're seeing on this paper is that bad considering it's copy paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather all over the place and spread entirely to, I want to say, a little bit just about really where the broad was on the Clairfontaine. So it's going from a fine to a broad here. Not a great look for this. It actually is shading some. Technically, you see some darker areas, but boy, does that make you worry about the bleeding. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. A little bit lighter, just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does feather a little bit, and it does spread a little bit, though in this case, I don't think it's spreading as much because it's going from a medium to a broad. The feathering is fairly under control. It's not distracting, though if you look at the T in bit and the F in of, it kind of is some. But the feathers spread there, it's expected. It's not shading, which is good news when dealing with copy paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. It does spread. It does not shade. It does not look great as a green for me on this paper, but I've also looked at a lot of greens over the past few years, so maybe I'm just especially picky. Looking at the page underneath, you see that the broad and the medium only had one spot where they bled through and touched. The wet fine had a few, soft fine had none. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how much ghosting you would expect, which means you could probably use it with the soft fine. I don't know that I would with any of the others.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Considering how consistent this ink is from most every pen, this would seem to be, obviously a dealer's choice ink, but that isn't really true. Use any pen you want except for dry fines, because with the dry fine, it lightens up enough that a full page of writing could be a little bit painful to your eyes just in having to read the lighter tone. That being said, that would probably be fine if you're using it as a second ink on the page. As a primary ink, pretty much any pen you want to use, you're going to get a consistent performance.
This is the end, and thanks for watching.